Nevertheless, visitors to the island also were in agreement that something wonderful had happened on this island.
We plan to restore it faithfully, do it very well, and I think it will be a stellar attraction.
In life, there are some whose passion drives them to perfection, fueling their relentless pursuit of excellence in every endeavor, each stroke of the brush. Every note played and every word written is infused with purpose and dedication. These individuals do not merely go through the motions, they pour their hearts and souls into their craft, constantly pushing boundaries and redefining standards. My name is Sherwood McCaskey. It is not the type of program which we ordinarily take pleasure in welcoming you to. However, when a man dies in the service he has chosen, it is our responsibility to honor him and his legacy. On January the 11th, 2025, historian Dr. Karl Watson passed away after a life of service to this nation, to this region, and to humanity. This evening we begin a two-part series where we will celebrate the life, the work, and the legacy of the late Dr. Karl Stuart Watson. Dr. Karl Watson, a legacy unearthed.
My memory goes back to the early days of the University of the West Indies when he was on the student council and organizing carnival, for instance, and other events for the university at that time, along with another, I'm talking about the 60s, mid-1960s. And he was one of these people that grasped the opportunities of life from the very beginning. His family says that he was beginning to try to learn to read by himself at 2 years old. And he picked up along that way, good at school and participating in everything that he could. I remember back in around the time of Barbadian independence, when in 1966, a lot of shows and events were being held around that time. And there was this musical play at Combermere School. And I saw the National Dance Theatre come on performing. And there's this tall, slim, white guy among all the other Barbadian dancers, rolling his waist, swinging. And I'm wondering, well, who is this guy? And then later on I asked, and he said, oh, he's a young student called Karl Watson. Later on, of course, I got to know him very well. And he said, you see, I mean, I wanted to be in everything that was going. I don't want to miss out. And that really was the pattern of his life, because he was born in the area of Beccles Road and Culloden Road. Part of his family, the McClearys, were more on the Beccles Road side, and then the Watsons along Culloden Road. And he always talked about the community there.
Dr. Watson, which I knew him as Watty because we grew up when we were young kids. I was living in Darkies Road, and he was living in Culloden Road, at the top of Culloden Road, where it meets Beccles Road. Across the street was the Progressive, in those days, the Progressive bus terminal. You ever heard of the Progressive bus terminal? Yeah, there were all their buses was colored in red and yellow, and they were immaculate, really nice buses. Anyhow, Watty and I grew up within reach of one another, and then our parents would, on an evening, would take us all to Bayland, which was a big area in those days. You could run all over the place, and it wasn't like it is today. Bayland was just, I think they had a football field at the time, but other than that, it was just a big open space with two horses running around out there even.
And his focus on the bay pasture of all the, goings on and sports and children from the bayland playing. And he always prided himself in growing up within that circuit, that he wasn't a plantation person and tied to a kind of separate society. And therefore, from those early days, he was in the mix of things.
After we got a little older, after that, we sort of hung out down in Burke's Beach. And Burke's Beach was down on the sea. And we had friends there, David Burke and A fella called Stephen Lewis was also a good friend. I don't know if you know that name, but he became a boxer and he was very successful. He got a bronze medal, I think, in the Central American Games. But we would hang out there and we go spearfishing and go over to the aquatic club to play water polo. In those days, we couldn't walk on the beach because we could leave Burke's Beach and swim to the aquatic club, but we couldn't walk on the yacht club. That wasn't allowed. It was before diabetes wine by Gary, so we couldn't go on the beach. Anyhow, we would go across and play water polo and spend all of our days, young days, hanging out at the aquatic club playing water polo. He was a very good water polo player. He played for Harrison College and he was very good.
He got involved very much with swimming and began swimming with the Barbadian Polo Club. He was one of the teams of swimmers. And they, of course, would compete in those days. Water polo was a great thing. And you had even a team from the police service that were involved and others. And so he really was part and parcel of all that was going on and very interested in it as well. He was a good student at Harrison College and loved things like classics and literature and that kind of stuff. So from very early on, he had a very kaleidoscopic, a very mixed interests.
He was always a very, very intelligent guy. I mean, you know, we were sort of out spearfishing and all this sort of thing, but he was always a little more serious and about everything. You know, he was okay, never got upset or annoyed. He was always very cool and calm, but he was very intelligent. You could tell that he was a very smart guy. You know, whereas we were more interested in what fish we can catch. You know, he would think things out better. I remember going around the point here one time with him in a boat. With 3 or 4 of us in a little Moses, what I call a Moses, you know, we spearfishing. And when we were finished, we got in the boat and somebody had caught a conger, a big conger, and the conger was still alive, and the conger started to fly all over the place in the boat. So everybody is now standing on the seats of the boat because you don't want to lose a toe. And Stephen Lewis, the same guy that became a boxer, he says, "Oh, leave it to me, leave it to me." He took up an oar, bomb. Of course he missed. Bore a big hole in the bottom of the boat, so the boat just went and sunk. And we had a swim ashore by the Hilton, and with the conger swimming all around the boat. But we had some wonderful days, especially, you know, Karl was always there and made it interesting.
After he left school, he went to work at the Royal Bank, and the manager, besides his skills in just being a bank clerk, realized that he had a kind of diplomacy, an openness about him. And so if there were distinguished account holders who were visiting, he would direct Karl to talk with them and organize their business for them. And one of the most famous was the Rainey of Sarawak, Sarawak being a British colony out in the Far East. And she retired. She was the last Rainey of Sarawak, and she retired to Barbados. And so Karl was one of those persons who interacted with her on a regular basis. And she used to give in these fantastic accounts of life in the early 20th century out there in the Far East. And so that kind of link and aspect. But at the same time, while he was dealing with these leading luminaries that came to Barbados, lived in Barbados, or were Barbadian, he also mixed with, as I mentioned, in terms of the Bayland and his association with that part of Bridgetown, he was very much in tune with all that was going on in the Carinage, for instance. He said the Carinage was this really colorful place, and then you'd get these women coming off the ships from St. Lucia and Dominica with all their colorful head ties and all of this, and he would follow their Creole patois. And what was remarkable, I always thought about him, was his amazing skill with languages. He would speak French, Spanish, German, and of course the Creole, because when he was lecturing in Jamaica at Mona, he would go across very often to Haiti. And so he was very au courant with the Haitian Creole. And in his diplomatic service, he would also, of course, be skilled in these languages for his work. So he then moved on to university, and he applied and got a scholarship to Gainesville, Florida. Now, that is where another aspect of his life, archaeology, came into play. And the University of Florida, Gainesville, is one of the key areas for Latin American, Caribbean archaeology where he was. And what always amused him through his life is that all these applications were done from Barbados, preliminary applications and acceptances, and the documents that he needed would be sent back to him here in Barbados, and then he received his ID card. And because he was coming from the Caribbean, they just jumped to a certain conclusion. And so his ID card described his race. Of course, this is Southern USA in the 1960s, as Negro. So there he is with his Negro card, and he kept it for years. And he always would use it as a sort of teaching tool to show how United States attitude to race and West Indies attitude to race and mix and all that is so different and has a certain different nuance. And all of these things would come into play. Then he moved on to the diplomatic service for Barbados. When Barbados became independent, of course, a number of embassies and consulates opened up. And one of the first was to recognize Barbados as an independent nation was Venezuela. So he was posted in Venezuela.
Paying a tribute to Dr. Karl Watson is really a challenge because he did so many things. Let me begin by saying he was one of the most conscientious and committed Barbadians around. He's lived a long life. He was over 80, but he has done many, many things, and they've all been for the development of Barbados. He began as a diplomat, and he served Barbados in several countries. And as I said earlier in the news report a few days ago, he was multilingual, and very few Barbadians are multilingual. Many of us, including some of the most famous people, are bilingual. We speak standard English and we speak Bajan dialect. That's two. Well, Karl, in addition, was understandable and fluent, especially in Spanish, but also in Portuguese and French. And this made him a boon wherever he went as a diplomat. He even had a little German because he was also posted in Germany.
For a certain time, he was in Frankfurt, in Germany. And with the diplomatic service, it would overlap, and part of the work carried out by the consul in Frankfurt would be for tourism. So he was very involved in getting groups to come up from Barbados and perform for potential German visitors in Frankfurt. And he said, everybody in Barbados felt it was correct to send up a steel band because steel band were what associated with the Caribbean. And he was very keen to send up a tuck band. And they said, no, I don't think that'll be a little wide, a little bit out of step. But no, it was a great success. He put his foot down. He said, we must have this. And it was a great success. They took it to various parts of Germany, and it kind of gave a complete different perspective on the Caribbean than the German potential tourists had expected. And so in that regard, and this is of course during towards the end of the Cold War, so that Germany was divided, and every so often he would go across into East Germany. And from that potential, one of these languages that he excelled in also was German. But then in the 70s, jumping a little back, when he was in Venezuela in 1976, when there was the Cubana disaster in October of 1976, and the Honorable Tom Adams was the Prime Minister of Barbados. Karl was in Venezuela, and with being one of the most adept in Spanish speaking in the diplomatic service in Barbados, he was on call to make links. This was a international incident between Cuba, Venezuela, the United States, and of course, linking up and informing cabinet and the prime minister. So although he kept very quiet about that aspect, of course, there were a lot of, potentially difficult difficult information contained in all of that. And for security purposes, even after that, he had to keep very quiet. So he also was in Canada for in Ottawa. And then he moved on. There again, you get this idea of a person who is can't waste any time, and they're really moving into action on every front. And so from then, he moved to UWI, the University of the West Indies, to be a lecturer in Jamaica, in Mona. And it was, of course, always from that time, heritage and history. And in fact, he was there during Hurricane Gilbert. And for the rest of his life, he had a problem with one of his feet, because he went up on a roof during Hurricane Gilbert when he thought, didn't realize that there was this eye passing over and that it would come back. He went up to fix the roof, and then he almost died being swept down over the roof, landing on his ankle, and that was damaged really more or less for the rest of his life. So all of these experiences, and of course he then, in his Jamaican phase at UWI, got very deeply involved with Jamaican culture and the art as well. You see, he had this other facet as well, this appreciation of art on all levels. And one person described to me that going and visiting him at his house in the Garrison was rather like being in an African compound, because there were all these masks with shells over them and paintings and carvings and stuff from Africa with that link, which actually a lot of it was Jamaican art with an African bent, and art from West Africa particularly. So there was that facet in Jamaica, and he had this skill. Of course, he seemed to have had this skill with dialects and language. And so he could be there with pure Jamaican. He would hit you with wonderful Jamaican phrases and talk. And when Bob Marley came to Barbados once on a visit, and for some reason Bob Marley never, from what I understand, never performed here, but came on a visit. At that time, Karl was operating a motorbike and knew Bob Marley from Jamaica and invited Bob to be on the back of his motorbike and took him on a tour of Barbados. And the image of Bob Marley on the back of a motorbike with Karl in front, going around the island was quite something. And of course, he loved the reggae music. And peculiarly, too, he also loved country and western. And not too much of a country western fan, but boy, did he love it. He played it all the time, as St. Lucians do. I mean, there's one amazing Caribbean feature that St. Lucians, for historical reasons, because there were Americans based in St. Lucia, are key followers of country western. And Karl, of course, knowing St. Lucia, tie that in. So he left Jamaica and then came down to lecture in Barbados at Cave Hill, where he had, as I mentioned, had been associated with for years and years.
Karl was responsible for the heritage program here at this campus. Many of his MA students can attest to that.
And that attracted many students. A lot of those students were mature students who had a first degree and then went back when they realized that this gave them an exciting opportunity of improving their credentials, improving their training, their study, their education, and also to do a research project, because the central thesis of that program was, in fact, to do a thesis. And many people like Mary Brathwaite, for example, who was the sister of Kamau Brathwaite. Mary was a brilliant historian as well. And she produced a beautiful book from her thesis on the story of Bay Street in Barbados. So that is one of the things that Karl did, and it broadened the history field in Barbados tremendously. It oriented a lot of young people towards history research.
And that is significant because even though Barbados has a rich history and heritage, we had not really given any significance to the heritage economy or to heritage tourism. So that in the late 1990s and the early 2000s, when heritage was in full swing here at this campus, students got an understanding of heritage and were able to make that heritage studies program work for them.
And this, once again, was not just a matter of sitting in a classroom and listening to lectures and studying textbooks. He wanted to get the students out and hands-on to all the artifacts, the places, and the people that are associated with that. And of course, linking up with understanding Barbadian heritage through its links with other Eastern Caribbean places. And that is key. And I understand that just within the last few weeks, there is now an archaeological heritage program has been renewed, rebuilt within the University at Cave Hill, and there have so far been about 10 applicants that have registered for this program. So the spirit, in a way, of Karl's work continues. And I'm sure that Tara Innes, who was a student of his, will follow in his footsteps in ensuring that this well-balanced area of research is done.
Myself and Margaret Brooms, now Dr. Margaret Brooms, we were his little birds. We were his first 2 students in the university's Masters in Heritage program. And Karl really took us under his wing. I remember we used to go to his house for our tutorials, and on Saturday mornings, once we took a break, then we went to his kitchen and we cooked cuckoo and saltfish, and we sat down and we ate that. And that was the kind of man he was. He always was there to help his students.
He looked out for his students, and his care of his students is exemplified in this example. I remember having an assignment, and the night before the assignment was due, I got a call from Dr. Watson. The assignment was due the next day. I got a call from him late in the night after 8 o'clock, I would say, and in his soft, calm, quiet voice, he said, "Claudette, you turned in your assignment?" And to be quite honest, I was under so much pressure at that time in my life. I couldn't even remember if I had turned it in. I'm not quite sure. He said, "But I'm not seeing your assignment." So after checking the computer and all that, I realized I had not turned in the assignment. Dr. Watson said, "Listen to me. Once you get that to me by 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, I will take it. I won't reject the assignment." And I worked that entire night. And I am telling you, there was something with me that night because I worked through the night, got all the sources, got everything together, and got a really good grade on that paper. So thanks to him, if he had not called me and he didn't care about his students, when he looked through the papers and saw that my assignment was not among them, he could have gone on and not called, but he did, because he really did care about us, and he treated us, he showed how much he cared in the way that he would respond to us and interact with us.
You know, Dr. Watson was my teacher. He was my supervisor for my PhD thesis. He was my mentor. He was a friend. He was an advocate, a consummate diplomat, just so lovely and kind to everyone and everything, natural and cultural. And today I think is a very, very sad day for Barbados and the loss that we have sustained, really. We've lost, as I said, an oracle, somebody who was able to push into the past and bring those stories to the present. And that's such an important gift to us. And I'm so completely moved by his presence with us. And I think his work will continue to live on.
I got to know Dr. Watson from being one of his students. And I was always impressed about his knowledge of not only Barbadian history, but he loved every aspect of it, and he would also include not just the what we would term the social history of Barbados, but he would look at how history and the environment, and especially the aspect of it, I was particularly impressed how he would bring the two together. And I fondly remember as part of our history program, his lectures and his presentations, he would sometimes take us on field trips.
Karl was the essence of a Caribbean man. He knew his archaeology, his pre-Columbian archaeology, which he was very interested in, the Afro-Barbadian presence in this country he celebrated. So there's so many facets to Karl that you will hear from his students, from his friends, and from his colleagues.
I can also recall his love for Barbados as his country and the love of the culture of Barbados. He loved music, he loved dance, he loved all cultural aspects, the arts as a whole. Generally, he loved the arts. And he would always talk about a dance called the Joe and the Johnny, which is a very old cultural dance in our art form. But as younger people, we don't know anything about the Joe and Johnny. I have never seen it performed. And he would always talk about this, and we are always goading him, trying to get him to perform the Joe and the Johnny for us. And he never did. So I sometimes wonder, did Dr. Watson really know how to perform the Joe and the Johnny? Because he was a really jovial person, a fun person in classrooms. He talked about all kinds of things and told us a lot of things that sometimes were not part of the class itself, but we learned a lot of things from him and got a lot of I don't want to say information only, but he just filled us up with stuff, is what I would tend to say. From his own experiences. He was a diplomat, and so all the experiences that he had meeting different people across the world and going to a lot of the cocktail parties and interacting with people, he shared a lot of those stories with us as well. So he was full of information. He knew a lot of things, and he shared all that stuff, a lot of that stuff with us, for which I will be eternally grateful.
It is well documented his love of birds, animal life, and I remember taking us to a swamp to see the migratory birds and the whole life around these wetlands. So in those ways, you have to remember that special way of teaching history. Of course, his tours of Bridgetown and his knowledge of the architecture and some of the personalities in Bridgetown. And of course, he would always reflect, as part of his classes, his life, how his life in many ways reflected how he taught his history. Of course, I will say that we always agreed on his interpretations, but the fact is that he shared honestly his views, and we can also, there's much research that he has done that has contributed to the historical landscape of Barbados, and those things we have to be thankful for.
The Barbadian connection was very important because it was his hometown, but he also did not want his students to feel blinkered that Barbados was the beginning and end of the region. And he worked on getting these tours every so often, once a year. Those students who could make it, he would take them to a different Caribbean island, whether it was Dominica, St. Lucia, or wherever. And this kind of filled them in with an awareness that there were these other cultures and other islands with maybe varied outlooks on the world, than Barbados. And that was very key because it gave the Barbadian students a more rounded awareness of their place within the region. Um, there was an amusing story once that, he would pick up these sources of information to show how history marched. They were delayed in St. Vincent once. The plane hadn't arrived or had difficulty, couldn't take off, and they were left for overnight in St. Vincent. Hardly anybody could sleep. But Karl picked up a St. Vincent phone book, and he went through the phone book, Bequia, Grenadines, and he pinpointed all the Bajan names, basically to illustrate the fact that so many people, St. Vincent, Grenadines, particularly Bequia, uh, have Barbadian roots because they came across from Barbados and they settled in these islands.
All of us were students of Karl. In the evening, on the news, in the newspaper, we all had something to learn, and I really appreciate his presence in our lives.
But there were other things, of course, that he was involved in public education, and this particularly with the assistance of people like Sherwood McCaskey and others in terms of bringing it to the television screen. So we have a number of programs that were done. One of them being the Charter of Barbados, which actually won an award from the Caribbean Broadcasting Union because it highlighted, and this would have been about 2012, highlighted the importance of that charter that was signed at Oistins, Mermaid Tavern in Oistins, back in 1652. So here was another aspect of Barbadian history, very important to world and imperial history that would have been lost had not this focus been dealt with, and also done it on a popular level. And it was, understandable and with due regard that it received this award.
I remember him and Lennox Honeychurch in one of the CBC produced videos on Spicetown, that series on Spicetown, where he's taken us through the alleys and the streets of Spicetown, showing us Dutch architecture in Spicetown. A remarkable video. And Karl knew perhaps every single nook and cranny in Barbados. So we've really lost a person who has devoted his life to the preservation of heritage.
And his television work was another aspect, because Sherwood McCaskey would utilize people who were passionate about history and who had the knowledge in their head, so that Karl and I and Dr. Lennox Honeychurch and others could simply go on camera with him and talk about the sites that he was filming. And the Spicetown series was an important one that he did.
Spicetown has great charm, whereas a lot of Bridgetown has gone by the way and been modernized. Spicetown, up to now, still maintains a certain character of its origins, and that important exporting port for the north of Barbados, and the way in which, for instance, in relation to the crisis of 1652, when the Roundheads and the parliamentary supporters were crashing in Barbados, and the Admiral ISQ came down to Barbados, anchored off Spicetown, and basically tried to hold Barbados to ransom for about 3 months. All of this was focused, although we've heard of Oistins, focused in the region of Spicetown. And so he, along with CBC once again, and McCaskey, were able to do a program about the importance of Spicetown. And you see, the thing with these is that here he is, the record is maintained, and you have a continuing document that can be played to other generations, maybe yet unborn, to show the story. And so that was an important component of his. And of course, he would always be asked to come on the television to talk about certain issues, whether it was about the monuments, the tombs of Barbados, or the wildlife, or the trees of Barbados, and the way in which they integrated with the society at the time and in a continuing manner. So many stories. And certainly Barbados has lost a gem in terms of knowledge. And one will only hope that it could be an inspiration to others coming up to be able to contribute their knowledge and their awareness of Barbados to new generations.
Karl stood in the vanguard of the preservation of heritage in Barbados. He wanted to see the heritage economy thrive. He wanted to ensure that our buildings were not torn down by people who just wanted to build anew. And that is why Karl was on the scene when the government was thinking about the tearing down of the building of London Bourne on Bay Street. And Karl wrote to the press, he protested, and the government still went ahead. But Karl was resolute in maintaining that the building should be preserved. And of course, other buildings as well, other sites as well. And of course, Karl was one of our leading historians, offering his insight into Bridgetown and its garrison and all of that work to ensure that Barbados got World Heritage status.
Dr. Watson can be described as prolific and balanced in the way that he approached history. Another historian, author, Maurice Greenidge, who is also steeped in history in Barbados, had great interactions with Dr. Watson. And so I would have spoken on the passing of Dr. Watson. Maurice Greenidge and I would have had some conversations, and Maurice remembers him as prolific and balanced. That's what he would say about the long-term relationship that they had. He would call Dr. Watson would call him, they would discuss stuff, bounce ideas and information off each other. And so Dr. Watson has had a long relationship with all things history, Barbados. And as a result of that, he is a great loss to us. And I hope that a lot of us as his students have imbibed some of the things that he has left with us, so that we're not totally lost all that he would have put in all the years that he would have taught history, practiced history. And he would have given his history in different ways through different media. He was an actor. He acted out his skits, and that's one of the things I do in my tours, getting that from him. Sometimes history can be a dry topic depends on how you do it. If you don't have a great love for it, people can find it boring, so you have to find ways to do that, and Dr. Watson was very good at doing that kind of thing. He acted, he danced, he sang, and, he was great at what he did. So we would have gotten a lot out of Dr. Watson, a lot over the years as Barbadians. We would have learned a lot of him and from his experiences. A great researcher, writer, and teacher. Like I said before, he would have taught us so many things and transferred his knowledge to us in a great way.
Karl was a wonderful historian, a historian who sought to develop the history of Barbados, who sought to uncover the history of Barbados, who sought to give us new knowledge as a country, new knowledge as a republic. And I want to highlight about 4 books that he has written in his career. I think he's written more than 4, but this one here, Barbados First, the Years of Change. And this is Barbados in the 1950s, 60s, even before that, 1930s, etc. It is a pictorial book, and you have a lot of photographs of old Barbados, but you also have, for example, the write-up as well. And this is a photograph of the HARP project at Foul Bay, and Errol Barra is there in the photograph, and there's a write-up on the HARP project. So that when you go through this book, you see lots of interesting photographs. This is one here on the Sir Garfield Sobers when he was knighted at the Garrison in 1975, shaking the hand of Queen Elizabeth II. So this really shows Barbados growing up in the colonial period and then in the post-colonial period. And this is a magnificent piece of work. And I hope that we find some funds to reprint this, to republish it, and to ensure that these copies are in the diaspora, that these copies are seen and read by Barbadians, you know, throughout this land. And Karl also wrote a book on the Newton slavery experience. It is called A Kind of Right to be Idle, Old Doll and Her Family. And what he did there was to really give us a synopsis of what happened during slavery on a plantation. So he talks about the escape of Elizabeth Betsy Newton, who in 1795 left the plantation, went to St. Vincent, then somehow got a captain to take her to England, and somehow got some connection to take her to the home of the absentee planter, a man called Thomas Lane. And she knocked at his door, and Thomas Lane was probably surprised to see an enslaved woman from Barbados coming to have 2 interviews with him, in which she chastised the planters here in Barbados and asked for the freedom of her son, Robert. Karl brought that story to Barbadians, brought that story to the world. And then we find in around 1798, he brings another story of this Newton experience where it was Easter and the planters had gone off to Bathsheba to enjoy their recreation, enjoy the surf and enjoy the health of Bathsheba. And the enslaved people decided they are going to have a fun day at Newton. And when they came back, they saw donkey races going on, selling and people selling rum. There was this woman called Old Doll selling rum from her rum shop. So they had a fun day. And that book introduces us to the life of the enslaved people at Newton. Wonderful book. It's a thin piece, but really well written, well illustrated, and that is the book I would want to commend to all Barbadians, A Kind of Right to be Idle.
He produced a book which is a classic. It was called The Civilized Island Barbados, and that book was the result of his PhD thesis on basically 18th century Barbados, because in the 18th century, Barbados was almost a product of what was called in Britain the Age of Enlightenment or the Age of Reason.
He shows how Barbadian society developed, how the English brought their institutions, to Barbados, and how the English brought their place names to Barbados, and they colonized this space. And it is important for us, therefore, even as a republic, to look back at those years of colonization to see what were the major aspects of that colonial society. And Karl, in his book, points us to those aspects.
And there were scientists living and working in Barbados, coming out of Barbados. You might say that Colonel Christopher Codrington was an iconic aspect of that story because his story began at the cusp of the 17th and the 18th century. He died in 1710, and of course he wanted a university in Barbados to train doctors and priests, or rather a combination. And in his will, he said training students who, having been trained in medicine and surgery and theology, would then be better able as healers of men's bodies to cure or heal their souls, to deal with their souls. So Christopher Codrington was almost in anticipation of that age of reason, but it was a very prominent aspect of Barbadian society in the late 18th century, at the time when people were recognizing that slavery was going to come to an end. It had to come to an end, and there was a great abolitionist movement, which was actually co-led in England by a Barbadian called Aline. And that is another man whom Dr. Watson wrote about and brought the famous John Aline, the lawyer, who was an abolitionist in Britain fighting for abolition, to the attention of Barbadians through the Museum Journal. So I have spent a long time trying to persuade Dr. Watson to have a new edition of The Civilized Island, Barbados, republished. And that is something that Sally Miller of Miller Publishing has undertaken to do in the coming year, I hope. It's a very important historical document and a crucial part of Barbadian historiography.
But he also has an article, a very good article, in the Journal of Barbados Museum and Historical Society, which he edited for a long time, over 20 years. And this is in the 2000 edition of the journal. And it is about the iconography of the Bassa Rebellion, in which he brings to focus, he brings to life the hidden aspects of the rebellion, what we call the non-military aspects of the rebellion. And what Karl was able to uncover using the British archives were these photographs, these images of the enslaved people and what they were thinking about, what they were really after. And my view is that the enslaved people were really after independence. And Karl was able to show us that they drew an independence flag called the Endeavour flag. And that Endeavour flag is online for most people to see today. And it's a flag with a black man and his wife. It is a flag with a ship, a British warship. And the black people in those days were thinking of an alliance with the British Army, fighting the enslavers here in Barbados. It is a flag that shows the enslaved man, or the formerly enslaved man, with a rifle by his side, meaning that he's going to protect that freedom. For us, therefore, that is significant. It is a significant find because these people were serious about taking the country. They were serious about independence and being masters of the country, not just to rise up and rebel and then what, but to take the country and rule the country. And that article on the iconography of the Bassa Rebellion, or the 1816 Rebellion, is, in my view, a very important find, a very important piece by the late Dr. Watson.
And he not only wrote superb editorials, he was a great judge, and he was a very, very good editor, proofreader, and so on. His proofreading was good, his editing was good, his journal selection was good, and his journals were very balanced. And he himself, of course, in addition to writing editorials, wrote some superb articles, some on general history, some on people, individuals, some on birds. One of his articles was particularly interesting. It was a man called Joseph Rachel. He was a black businessman who did extremely well a couple of 100 years ago, and very few people knew about him. In fact, I venture to say that there couldn't have been half a dozen people who'd ever heard of this famous, brilliant merchant in Barbados. He was quite an amazing man, and his story is told by Dr. Watson about 10 years ago, 2014 or sometime back then, before he gave up the editorship of the journal. And I well remember when he wrote his editorial for his last issue in the journal, before passing it on to Professor Pedro Welch, he said this was a labor of love. And you can understand that. A full-time job, almost, but entirely unpaid, editing the journal every year. I must say that I tried to persuade Dr. Watson, and I'm still trying to persuade Professor Welch, that the Museum Journal, which is a small octave-sized journal, does not allow for the proper presentation of photographs, tables, and maps. And I've been saying for 20, 30 years, back when Peter Campbell edited the journal, that it should be a full-size A4 journal, like most journals. And that would allow you to read the maps and read the tables and read the captions and see the details of pictures without having to use a magnifying glass. So that's my message in this interview. That is something I didn't succeed in persuading Karl and the editors of the journal, the other editors in the Museum Council, to produce a larger format journal. I still hope that that will happen, to give due credit to all the lovely photographs that get included by people like Dr. Watson and others. Beautiful photographs of birds, detailed historical maps that you can't actually read. These deserve to be larger.
Just after he retired, he dedicated his time to a book that is published by the Barbados Museum, edited by Sir Woodville Marshall. It is called Place Names of Barbados. And Karl was one of the contributors to that book. It's called Of Halls, Hills, and Holes. And Karl, I understand, contributed significantly for St. Lucy and for St. Michael. So that even though he retired, he did not hang up his boots. He was still writing, he was still researching. And we have benefited tremendously. The country has benefited. The university has benefited from Karl's work as a historian. And he's also brought us brought to our knowledge the work of Joseph Rachel, a black man, a significant merchant in Barbados in the 18th century. And I think Karl was able to point out to us where he's buried in St. Mary's churchyard. And these things are important because we normally view slavery in a one-dimensional way. But here are these enslaved blacks that get their freedom and they become merchants. So we have Joseph Rachel and then later on London Moore, and are able to excel in the slave community.
And then, of course, he had this passion for nature and wildlife. And he was a real fighter for the protection of wildlife. I mean, the whole effort that he made towards the establishment of the protection of Graham Hall Swamp, for instance, and the getting of an American millionaire, Canadian, I think, Peter Allard, to finance the purchase of the lands at Graham Hall for their protection.
Dr. Watson was also a bird watcher. That's one of his areas of tremendous interest. And I remember once he told us at the National Trust Council table that 2 birds that would come to the little table on his patio for the grub that he would give them, and he gave them names. But that was the kind of person he was. He was intimately familiar with birds. He knew them all. He knew their names. He knew everything about these glorious birds of Barbados. And he did a lot to protect birds. He was not in favor of the bird shooting at the swamps. And that led to the development of the clay pigeon shooting in Barbados instead.
And that was not limited to Barbados, because he introduced a lad to the forestry department in Dominica, and they purchased a large area of land for the protection of the national bird, the Cicero parrot, Amazona imperialis, and the second one, Amazona orisiaca. That was the red-necked parrot. And today in Dominica, there's this extension of the Diablotin National Park, thanks to Karl and his involvements with that. And he was always keen and careful about the way in which the land was being used. Sometimes, of course, he would conjure up enemies, particularly in relation to the one aspect of Barbadian culture in relation to the swamps, the shooting of birds, migrating birds that landed in the swamps, particularly in the eastern part of Barbados, in areas like St. Philip and wherever, up in St. Lucie. And he really fought that, and he made some enemies along the way. But, you know, his concern really was for, in a way, the birds. He would point out, look, these birds are coming from beyond the Arctic Circle, and they're flying those thousands of miles, and they're landing in Barbados just to be shot by a group of privileged people behind a kind of hide, and killing all these birds. And they're trying to make their way down to Tierra del Fuego at the end of South America, you know. And it was that kind of concern. It was concern for the wildlife itself. He also spoke out a great deal about the whaling, the permission that was granted for so-called indigenous whaling in the Grenadines, where he said, you know what, I mean, there's so much food available now in terms of imported chicken or even locally done meats and stuff. Why are you allowing people to kill these whales? And they are allowed a number of whales per year, and orcas, and they kill them. And this really used to upset him intensely. And he pointed out that, look, this is not indigenous whaling. This was brought here by the Yankee sailors and the Scottish shipbuilders in the 19th century. You know, this is not anything that the indigenous Kalinago people would have done. And that was another aspect of his kind of historical awareness. He always wanted to get to the basis of the issue. Like, you know, the great ongoing debate among historians about Busser and Washington Franklin in masterminding the Easter Revolt of 1816. And so these debates come up, but Karl always wanted to say, look, we're not dealing with what is populist in 1970s, 1980s. Yes, we understand why, because this is the image that people want, or a certain group of intellectuals feel that should be promoted. But if we have to get to the root of how this major national event occurred, we've got to take on board the others who may not be seen as hip, if you want to use an outdated word, and attractive in terms of interpreting the story. And that was the kind of historical research that he insisted on. Don't get carried away with the crowd and the passions. Find out exactly what the roots of this story is all about.
Of which we all benefited. Dr. Watson's commitment was not just about personal success. It was about leaving a lasting impact, inspiring others, and elevating the world around them. His was an unwavering dedication to transform ordinary efforts into extraordinary legacies. His work reminds us that true excellence is not a destination, but a journey marked by passion, resilience, and an unyielding desire to create something meaningful. Dr. Karl Watson, A Legacy Unearthed.